a man unique in Athenian society. A man called Socrates.
If you were an ancient Athenian citizen, the first thing you'd see is a man who was unbelievably ugly. His head was too big, his eyes were too large, his nose was all the wrong shape. Socrates' appearance breaks every rule of classical Greek aesthetics, of the idea of proportion and measure.
Socrates walked the streets of Athens barefoot, clad only in a dirty robe. He cared nothing for appearance, or any of the other conventions of his day. Socrates was interested only in the mind. This unlikely figure would become the leader of a revolution. A revolution in thinking that had been gathering strength across the Greek world. For thousands of years, mankind had assumed that the world around them, the sun, the stars, and the moon, were gods and spirits. Believing they were recording messages from their gods, ancient civilizations such as the Babylonians had gathered great catalogues of astronomical data. This detailed astronomical calendar from Babylon records the rising and falling of the constellations and the gods they represented. This knowledge and study of the heavens had been slowly spreading across the ancient world until it reached Greek colonies on the coast of what is modern-day Turkey. There, a shattering change occurred. For the Greeks took this astronomical knowledge and transformed it. They took the gods out of the heavens and replaced them with reason.
Gradually the Greeks begin to say, these are not persons, these are things. There's an orderly world which the human mind can actually capture. It is subject to our understanding.
These Greeks began to calculate and predict the movement of the moon and stars through mathematics and logic, rather than using gods and spirits to explain everything. It was the birth of science. The first great Greek scientist, a man named Thales, wrote the earliest book on navigation and how to sail using the stars as a guide. And on a journey to Egypt, Thales was the first man to measure the height of the Great Pyramid.
Brilliant idea. He stood next to the pyramid until high noon, when his shadow was exactly the same length as his height. And at that point he measured the shadow of the pyramid and accordingly knew the the height of the pyramid, which is actually an application of a rather sophisticated geometrical theorem.
These Greek scientists would go on to measure the circumference of the world when most people still thought it was flat. To devise steam engines, water pumps, and suspension bridges. But Socrates was not interested in the mechanics of the physical world. He would use this new way of thinking, using reason and logic, to study people.
The great change comes with Socrates, who turns his back, so to speak, to the world of nature. What he cares about is the individual. You become an object of study and care.
Socrates spent his days in conversation, walking the streets of Athens, talking and debating with anyone he met. With over 150,000 people now packed behind Athens' walls, he was in his element.
One of the amazing things about Socrates is that he is the first fanatical urban individual. He loves the city. He makes life in the city one of his major concerns.
Socrates' life was spent questioning the assumptions his fellow Athenians held about their lives. What they felt was right and wrong, what was good and bad. And he was happy to turn convention upside down. One of Socrates' followers recorded how, at the end of a drunken dinner party, Socrates proved to a fellow guest that he was in fact the better looking of the two.
My eyes must be more beautiful because they bulge out, and therefore I can see better. And by the same account, my nose is more beautiful because my nostrils flare out, and so I can therefore gather in more smells.
This is typical Socrates, using reason and logic to examine the world anew.
Socrates says you must make every decision based on your own understanding of what is good and what is not good, what is right and what is wrong.
For Socrates, this freedom of thought was paramount, even if it meant upsetting the whole notion of a beautiful nose.
I tell you, let no day pass without discussing all the things about which you hear me talking. A life without this sort of examination is not worth living.
But as Socrates spent his days in debate, his city was fighting a war. The Spartans invaded Athenian territory and set about burning all the farmland around the city. The Athenians became increasingly anxious. They could only watch from the city walls as their fields and crops were destroyed. But such was Pericles' reputation, he managed to convince the Athenians to stick with his plan. The city could rely on her fleet and shipments from overseas to survive. Little did Pericles know that this fleet now carried an even greater threat. One year into the war, the grain boats that fed the city brought with them an additional cargo: plague. A disease that would now devastate Athens.
Pericles' plan couldn't anticipate difficulties that we now would suggest were rather likely in those circumstances of crowding. And the results were horrendous.
With the population crammed behind the city walls, the affliction spread like wildfire. The symptoms were horrific. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived through these years, recorded its effects.
The body was suddenly seized, first with violent heats around the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes, and then the disease descended into the bowels, producing violent ulceration and uncontrollable diarrhea. The sufferings of individuals seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature.
The city must have looked terrible, smelled terrible, been awful to be in, and terror must have reigned everywhere.
Sufferers, racked with fever and overcome with unquenchable thirst, would crawl into the city cisterns and water mains to die. Thucydides witnessed the scene in Athens streets.
The bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets. The catastrophe became so overwhelming that men cared nothing for any rule of religion or law.
The plague's effects on Athens were absolutely devastating. The whole fabric of Athenian society broke down. Morally, people saw no point in being good. Why be good if the good and the evil die just as easily?
The plague would kill over a third of Athens' population. And then it struck the city's figurehead, Pericles. Plutarch, Pericles' biographer, described his symptoms.
The plague seized Pericles, not with sharp and violent fits, but with a dull and lingering distemper, wasting the strength of his body and undermining his noble soul.
By the end, the patrician hero of the city was reduced to relying on potions and magic in an attempt to cure himself.
He showed one of his friends a charm that a woman had hung around his neck, as if to say that he was very sick indeed when he would admit of such foolery as this.
Finally, after 6 months of lingering illness, Pericles died in 429 BC. Pericles had planned to make Athens into the Mediterranean's greatest power. But his carefully calculated strategy had brought only disease and death.
Like most brilliant men, like most people who have had great success all their lives, Pericles simply underestimated the degree to which some things are out of the control of the very best intelligence and the very best knowledge that there are.
Pericles' death would have far-reaching consequences. It soon became clear that this one man had been the linchpin of the Athenian state. Plutarch records that the changes were swift and dramatic.
Those who while he lived had resented Pericles' great authority now realized that he had been the main protector of public safety. So great a corruption and such a flood of mischief and vice followed.
The flaws in Athenian democracy now became apparent. Without a single strong leader, countless figures now scrambled for the top position. And they were prepared to do anything the people wanted if it gave them power.
Pericles' successors, who now wanted to occupy the top position, simply followed the prejudices and passions of the masses in order to gain support.
Athenian democracy now revealed a new and terrifying potential. The potential to slide into mob rule. Crippling her ability to fight a war. As the conflict raged on, an Athenian naval force won a skirmish with the Spartans in rough and storm-tossed seas. The generals who had commanded the force returned to Athens expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, they were thrown into prison. The storm had forced the Athenian commanders to sail straight back to Athens, without picking up any of their soldiers who had fallen overboard during the battle. Rabble-rousing speakers had convinced the assembly that this failure to rescue the men was a crime so appalling that all the generals should be summarily tried and executed. We know of only one man who stood up and attempted to calm the fevered assembly: Socrates.
Socrates alone, and against the very, very serious and vocal and aggressive and mad, furious reaction of the public, stood his ground and said it was the wrong thing to do. He was going to vote against it.
Socrates' principle of questioning the society he lived in now had a real and practical purpose.
He refused to bow to any pressure and thought for himself and do the thing that his conscience and his reasoning told him was the right thing to do.
But in the end, Socrates was only one voice amongst the multitude, and he could not sway the assembly. The generals were condemned to death by drinking poisonous hemlock. It would be a terrible loss to Athens' war effort. With the assembly in the hands of self-interested despots, once mighty Athens began to lose her way.
After the death of Pericles, Athens never again had a political leader with a well-thought-out general picture or a set of goals that he could pursue with reasonable hope of bringing them to fruition.
The war against Sparta degenerated into a bitter, dragging conflict that spread over a decade. The Spartans ravaged the land around Athens, and the Athenian fleet kept the city supplied. Neither side was able to defeat the other. Deprived of victory, the Athenians grew increasingly frustrated. Were they not the greatest state in all of Greece? Surely the time must come for Athens to prove her power once and for all. Then, in the year 416 BC, a daring proposal was put before the assembly. A proposal which, even if it did not defeat the Spartans, would at least satisfy Athens' hunger for glory. A small Greek colony on the island of Sicily had asked for protection. Protection from a neighbor allied with Sparta. Why should the Athenians not come to their aid, humiliate their Spartan adversary, and perhaps conquer all of Sicily at the same time? As one Athenian addressed the assembly,
This is the way we won our empire, and this is the way all empires have been won. Let us set out on this expedition, for it will destroy the arrogance of the Spartans, and at the same time we shall become rulers of all Greece.
It was a bold plan to be executed on a vast scale, requiring a great fleet of warships and a landing force of over 10,000 men. The Athenians threw themselves into the project with fervor. Armorers beat out new weapons. Soldiers tested out their equipment. Stores were loaded onto a fleet of Athenian triremes. And the shipwrights prepared their vessels for the sea. Then, to great fanfare, the mighty invasion force set out for Sicily. Six months later, word came back. The campaign was not going as quickly as hoped. They needed reinforcements. And then, nothing. No news at all. Then, in the autumn of 413 BC, a sailor arrived in the city. A man who needed a haircut. And as he talked to his barber, he told an appalling tale of a vast and terrible slaughter. It was the story of an invading army that had been pinned down where it landed, of how its leaders had argued with each other about strategy, of how their food and water had run out, of how they'd attempted to ford a great river in a desperate attempt to escape.
They rushed into it, all discipline lost, and every man wanting to cross first. They fell over each other and trod each other underfoot, and they drank thirstily. The water was foul, but still they went on drinking, mud, blood and all, the dead lying thick in the riverbed.
This was how the Athenians discovered that they had been the victims of one of the greatest defeats in ancient history. Over 50,000 men had been killed or taken prisoner. 2 entire fleets of Athens' prized triremes had been destroyed.